Hello, Java Challenger. Today, I'm happy to host Simon Martinelli. Simon is a Java champion, Vaadin champion, Oracle Ace Pro, and is a worldwide speaker. He's also programming architect and lecturer for software architecture, and he's also focused on Java persistence and DevOps. Simon is also a Jooq leader from Switzerland Bear. So, Simon, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Hey, Rafael. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm very good today.
Okay, very good, very good. So, Simon, we're going to go through some questions about your career trajectory. And basically, I want to know how was your career trajectory? And I'm very interested in your career challenges and the possible insights you have for Java developers that they can also apply in their careers. So, can you share a little bit about your career trajectory?
Sure. The older you get, the longer you have a list. So I started in 1995, back in the days as a COBOL programmer on IBM Mainframe. And after the year 2000, I had the chance to move to the Java department. So I was working for Swiss Railways back in the days. And I don't know if you know that, but in my opinion, IBM was kind of involved in the Java development or kind of involved in bringing companies from IBM mainframe computers to Java. So because they had the J2E application server back in the days, and that was also my path. So I moved to the Java department, and then I started to get involved in many interesting projects. So I was quite in luck to be there because around 2000 there was kind of greenfield projects or a lot of greenfield projects. And for example, we started a project for the online ticketing. So Switzerland was the second country in Europe providing online ticketing. Back in the days, we didn't have any mobile phones, so we had to print out the tickets and bring them to the train. I think the first railway was the Swedish railway, and we took some technology to print out the tickets from the Swedish railway. So more or less, the challenges for me was more like moving from a procedural software development style with COBOL to object-oriented. So that was quite a big shift for me. And the other problem that we had when we started around year 2000 was that Java was really new. So Java was not new. It was like 5 years old already. But the whole J2E stuff with enterprise Java beans and application servers was very new. And this was very slow. So that was mainly the problem that we had. So the development speed or the developer experience, how we call it today, was not that good as you had now with modern frameworks where you just start the application from your IDE and it just works. So that was quite a challenge technical wise. The other challenge that I had during my career was moving from an employee to consultant. And this happened because I was working for Swiss Railways around 13 years in total. And then I was looking for another challenge and I found it with another company, with an international company. That was great because the first time in my career I had to talk in English during work, because before everything was in Swiss German, because Switzerland or Swiss Railways is like a government, or back in the day was a government-led company. Now it's a private company. They made the transition. But the day-to-day language was German. So Swiss German is a dialect of German language. So written, everything was in German. We even did the domain model in German. But then I moved to a company where I had to talk English, and my English wasn't that good at that moment. So that was a big challenge. I also had to work with people from all over the world, from Australia, for example, from Middle East, from India, from Poland. We had developers. And that was a quite big challenge. But the problem is that was exactly at the time where we had the financial crisis. So 2007, 2008. And because my company was an international US-driven company. They started to try to save money. And so they stopped a lot of projects we were working on back in the days. And so I was thinking about what I will do. And that was kind of the way that led me to doing consultant work, because I didn't want to go to looking for another job and do all the interviewing process. So I tried another way.
Very good. And how was exactly your transition from software developer to consultant? I imagine it's not easy. Like it wasn't only the English barrier. The mindset also changes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was in luck because I had a big network. So in my opinion, if you're working as an independent consultant, the bigger your network is, the more people you know, the simpler it may be to find projects. But I had this huge network because of my long time work at Swiss Railways, where I met a lot of people moving away from one company to another, and this potentially gives you new opportunities for your consulting work. On the other hand, I think it was not that big change because during that time, work was mainly done on site. So we didn't have any remote work back in 2008, 2009, or not a lot, I would say, because most companies were requiring to also the consultants to come to the office because we didn't have any access to the company's network. That was mainly the point. And so the transition was not that big, in fact, because it also felt like an employee. You know, you're just in a project and you're like the other developers, and it didn't make any big change if you're an employee of the company or if you're an external consultant. That changed now. That's completely different because currently I have also, for example, customers in Mexico or customers in the United States. And so this is a completely different kind of work. Not only the remote, but also for example, the other way of working in different countries and the time zone shift and stuff like.
Okay. But it's different, right? Because as a consultant, you have to find the client yourself and you have to put a price in your service and you have to negotiate like how you're going to deliver value. So how do you do marketing for those companies? Well, maybe some time ago it was different because you already had contacts, but nowadays, how is the process for developers who want to be consultants? Because some of my mentees want to be consultant and they don't know exactly the path, the way to become a consultant. And it's not only my mentees, like many Java developers and even Java champions want this route. So if you can just give some insights or talk about the main challenges on how to find customers, how to provide the services, how to negotiate your salary. I think those things are very challenging for developers because we focus so much on the technical side, but we forget completely the soft skills or the other crucial skills like marketing yourself, negotiation, communication. So can you share a little bit of your experience on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, but I was talking before was just about the work. But you're completely right because as a consultant, you are a one-man show. So you have a lot of duties. You're a marketing person, you're a finance person, you're doing sales, you're doing stuff like that. And in my opinion, there are various ways. So first of all, depending on where you live, you could try to start small or in your local area. And what I did also in the beginning when I was a consultant, I try to go to as many meetups I could and try to learn or get in contact with new people that I didn't knew to try to figure out if they're in need for consultants, for example. And by the way, that was also one of the reasons why I started the Java user group in Bern, because in Switzerland, we already have a Java user group since 1996. So it's one of the oldest Java user groups in the world. But this was only happening in Zurich. And then around when I started as a consultant in 2009, I asked them, hey, why don't we have a Java user group in Bern? could you also do the meetups in Bern? And then they said, sure, we can do that, but we need a host. And if you do the host, then we could have Java user group there. So that's why I started Java user group. First of all, to learn about or meet new people, for example, and share knowledge. That was the main goal. But as a consultant, also kind of as a marketing initiative, because if you're there, if you talk to people, if they get to know you, then the chances are higher to get to new projects, for example, or find new customers. That's one way. The other way that I do very often is I'm active on LinkedIn or on any other social media, doesn't really matter. But LinkedIn is, in my opinion, very handy because you can see where people are moving. So if you're in contact with people and you know the person is currently working on company A and he's get a new job at company B, then this is a prospect. So you should go and try to get in contact with the person and ask if they need some help, for example, at the new company where he's working. And that's also a way how you can get new customers, for example. On the other hand, you could try also on social media to kind of personal marketing. And I mean, I do not like to write so much. So I'm also a bit struggling when I have to write a lot. So I'm also writing articles in German Java magazines, for example. I have a blog, but writing is not that what I like to do. I prefer to speak. And that's why I became a speaker. And because I'm also a teacher at university, so I'm used to speak in front of a lot of people. So that was not something that scared me, but it's much easier to just talk instead of writing. So people are different, but if you can take part of a conference or a meetup or write articles on a blog or in magazines, you will have kind of a personal brand that you then can use also to sell. Because if you're contacting someone and they are looking, for example, at your LinkedIn profile, they may notice that you do a lot and you may be an expert in certain fields, depending on what you're talking or what you're writing. But that's very hard because, I started with that like maybe, let's say, 6-7 years later. Because first I really tried to just use my network. And then I started to speak at local meetups or at small conferences, mainly in Switzerland. And for me, the pandemic was great, by the way. So it was not good in terms of commercial or financial, but it was great in terms of public speaking because most of the conferences still happened. And it was, in my opinion, during that time easier to get into the program because they had more spots in the program because they were doing it online, right? And so during that, also if you do online conferences or if you're doing conferences that are recorded, that's something that I like because then you have a video on YouTube, for example, that you can share with your customer and say, hey, I was talking about that topic. That's the topic you're interested in. And they know that you're an expert in that topic. So in my opinion, everything that I do, like speaking, writing, is all about marketing, right? And that's the marketing part of my job.
Yeah. And one question, obviously, I see that you have a focus, but how do you choose the right focus to attract companies to your services? Do you solve a specific problem in your talks? Like when you give a talk, do you explain technologies or do you focus your talks in a specific problem you solve for companies? What's your strategy to attract the companies and have people reaching out to you and say, hey, Simon, you solved this problem. I have this problem. I need you to work for me. Can we talk about that? So how is your approach exactly?
Yeah. When I write articles or do talks, I usually try to talk about real world problems. So my talks and my articles are usually not, I don't want to say not beginner friendly, but they're not hello world level, right? So I don't go and say, look, that's Hibernate and how we start with that. I really try to always maybe I'm talking about Vaadin, for example, or about the Jooq persistence framework, but I usually try to put that in the context of a real customer project or a problem that I solved for a certain customer. And because there are no longer like really greenfield projects, so most of the projects that I usually do are either some enhancements of existing systems or modernization of existing systems. So that's also a focus that I have. Like when I do architecture talks, I try to also talk about how we can transition from an existing application to modern application. And that's why that's the point that, not the point, that's the field that I try to focus on. And I really think that focusing is very important. So if you're trying to sell yourself, you cannot say, I'm a Java developer. So you can say that, so that's not an issue. But there are, I don't know how many millions of Java developers are out there, and also how many millions of Java consultants are out there. You really should look at the kind of a niche. Sometimes the niche seems to be very small. So for example, I started with the Vaadin persistent UI framework like 6 years ago. And this also, I really liked the framework. It was more or less a coincidence how I get to the framework in the first project. But I realized that this is something that a lot of companies could learn from or benefit from if they're doing full stack development in a simpler way, especially if they have traditional business applications where you have a lot of database tables and UI forms and stuff like that. And from that, I also started a talk. I had one that was also during pandemic, I would say, for the Swiss Java user group. So if you want to start speaking about topics, you should really find your local group, Java user group, or any other software development group. And then you can practice, because this is simpler probably because you have a smaller group of people. Maybe you know more or less some of the people there. And that's the simpler way to get started instead of directly going to a big conference and try to speak there. And yeah, that's something. So maybe if you have a specific framework, or you have when you started your development career, you have some solution or pattern or an architecture style that you found that is beneficial, and then you can focus on that and check if this works. So you can always switch, so that's not an issue. I switched a lot during the last 16 years as a consultant, technology-wise, but also architecture-wise. But you shouldn't really follow the trend, because sometimes it's better to have some topic that is really a solution and not only a trend or a hype. Because hypes come and go, and most of the speakers or most of the people writing about stuff are going to that hype and going to talk about that hype. And then you are just one of a lot of people.
Yeah, focus change everything. And as you said, your main focus nowadays is modernization of Java applications specifically, or any programming language?
Any applications. It doesn't really matter. So most of the time it's Java application, because most of them are like 20 to 25 years old, because that's the time where most of the first Java or the big Java applications were built, at least in Switzerland, for bigger companies. But I also working on a project where we replace an Oracle Forms application. So this one is very old in the core. It's already 35 years old, the database model at least. And so it doesn't really matter what we're modernizing, because modernizing usually doesn't mean copy code from the old application to the new. Modernizing also means adopting new concepts, adopting new styles, for example, also in the UI part or in the architecture style. So usually you cannot copy or reuse a lot of the code. You can reuse the concept, you can reuse the business logic or the ID or the processes, but usually not really the code. So it really doesn't matter that much where the application usually originally came from, if that's .NET or C++ or something else.
And do you have a process to modernize applications, or it's case by case?
I mean, projects really differ. So first of all, because of the company culture, they have different ways to do software. So everybody's talking about agile, but if you're looking at different companies, agile doesn't mean the same for them. So some are really agile, some are not agile. And the most important thing when you do or try to do modernization is to doing a reverse engineering and analyze your systems, what they're really doing. Because usually you don't have any documentation or not a lot of documentation, or the documentation is not or is outdated, for example. And so the first thing that you need to do is really to find out what your application is doing. And then you should also not just want to copy old concepts to the new application. You really should look, are there processes that are not optimal? Do we have to improve somewhere? Do we have to improve the model? For example, do we really have to go to the users and ask them if they are happy working with the application or if there are problems doing that? And then you get a plan before you even touch the first line of code. So I think that the first steps in a modernization project is always kind of requirements, re-engineering, and try to figure out how we can do that. Because if you know the requirements, then you can also come up with an architecture. Otherwise, in the past, a lot of companies tried is, oh, we have an old monolithic system, let's do microservices. But that's useless. It's just the old application in a different architecture style with more distributed communication, but it's not better. And you should really also try to improve the application, not only to modernize it, also to improve.
And it takes a while to understand the business, right? Like, how long do you take approximately to have at least a grasp of the whole business? Or do you focus on a specific business that you already have expertise? Because from my career, from my experience, every company I was working for, the business was very different. And it takes a while to understand the requirements. The system is big. There is so much code. The system is complicated. So what is your strategy to understand and learn the business when you close a deal with a project, with a company?
That's a very good point. That's also a question that let's start with your question first. The point is I'm focusing on retail and wholesale domain. So I have the big retailers in Switzerland are my customer, or the biggest wholesale company in Switzerland where I'm currently doing a project is a customer of mine already for a long time. And I'm also I'm very knowledgeable in railway industry because I was working for Swiss Railways for a very long time. So I know my domains where I'm usually working in quite well. So I don't know the details, but I can imagine what they are doing. So I know the whole overall process in both cases. But I also have customers for example, from the industry. So I was working for a company that is building grinding machines and laser machines. And that's something I never did before. So I have no clue how this machine works, what I have to do with that. But there I didn't really need to know that in the beginning because usually you have someone who has this knowledge, Most often, these are the most busy people at the company that have the most knowledge. So you must find a way how to transfer the knowledge of these people to you or to the team that is doing the modernization. So you have to find a strategy or a way how to come from a very high level view down to the details. So I think it really helps to think in layers, so to say, or if you know the C4 model, for example, from Simon Brown, where you have different views on the architecture or even different views at the architecture or the business of your application. So the first thing that you really should do is try to understand the overall domain, kind of in a very high level perspective, right? You don't need to know the details, but you should try to understand what the company is doing. And then you can dig down depending on how deep you want to go in certain fields of the domain where you want to really look at. But it's very important. For example, what some companies do, For my wholesale customer, for example, if you start there as a software engineer or any other developer, not developer, any other employee in the IT department, you have to go to a market and see how the wholesale process works. So you have to work for a day in a market. So you have to help them to sell the goods. So you have to work, for example, at the checkout, or you have to be with the manager of a certain area of the store, do the orders with the suppliers and stuff like that. And you also have to go for a ride with the truck driver who is delivering the orders. And that way, you really see how it works. We already also did that in Swiss Railways. So if some new software engineers came in, they had to go outside and work at the railway station for a day or two and to see how people are working there, what they're doing. And this, if you can do that, this helps a lot. So maybe you already know the domain. So, I mean, everybody is going to a grocery store and buying goods. So you probably can imagine what happens there. So you have a checkout, maybe self-scanning or something, and then you go out. So this process sounds familiar, but you have no clue how the process works from, for example, the manufacturer of, I don't know, tomato sauce, for example, until it's in the store. And you need to know this logistics maybe process to your work as a software engineer, but you usually can take part of that. So just go out and work with the users of your software. That's not possible everywhere, right? So if you're probably working in finance or insurance industry, then it's a bit more difficult. But if you're working in kind of manufacturing or retail, logistics, railway, public transportation, they usually can do that. And you really should do that. And this helps a lot to learn about the domain. And that's also very interesting because people sometimes ask me, how should I start or how should I find a company to work as a software engineer or as a Java developer? And I usually tell them, hey, look for the industry that you like. Don't look for the technology because technology is more or less everywhere the same. The interesting thing is, or you have to have certain interest in the industry your employee or your customer is doing. So if you're not interested in finance, you shouldn't work for a bank as a software engineer because probably this gets boring somehow at some point, or you don't like what they're doing. I don't know. But if you have something that sounds interesting for you, then you maybe should find an employee or a project that at a company that does what you like or what you're interested in.
I really like this idea of working directly in the retail service to understand the business, understand the logistics and everything. I think that's a genius idea. Unfortunately, that's not possible in most areas, but for software developers to see how it works, to use the service, I think that's perfect to think better about the software. So I think that's very good. Yeah, it's a lot of work. So basically, your way to understand more about the business because you focus on what you want. You focus on retail and railways, right?
Yes, retail, wholesale. So retail and wholesale is not exactly the same because they have different processes. Because the main difference between retail and wholesale is in retail, every customer has the same price. And in wholesale, it depends on the negotiation between the customer of the wholesale company and the salesperson at the wholesale company. So depending on how big you are, for example, if you're a restaurant chain or you're a hospital chain or something like that, then you have much better prices than if you're a small customer. So that's mainly one of the biggest differences. And you also sell more goods. So you may get more or less a whole truck with goods just for you. So you don't go, and usually you don't, or very often you don't go to a store, you get delivered. So that's one of the differences. But other than that, everything is very similar. And the railways are also similar. They are not the same. It depends on the size. And I also can only speak for Switzerland because every country has different regulations when it comes to security, for example, or different IDs, how the railway process works. That's because the railway companies are so old they established their own process in each country.
Mhm. And when you find a company, what kind of help do you offer exactly? Is always about modernization, or you would analyze a problem they have and would say, hey, I can help you with this problem?
So I have three services, so to say. One service is regular software development. So if they are need for a lead software engineer, usually that's my position that I get in a project, for example, also part-time, or I also offer kind of a senior software engineer as a service. So I have a customer that has a team, but there is no really senior engineer in the team. And so they can ask me questions on Slack channel, for example, but I don't work for them the whole time. I'm just doing coaching and mentoring of the developers, for example. And on the other hand, I do architecture reviews, for example, or software reviews. That's something that people or companies often need. For example, I analyze also kind of problems that they have, or for example, if they need to upgrade the software, not modernization, more kind of upgrade. For example, if you're using the Apache Camel framework and you're using version 3, version 4 is very different. So you can do a lot of things automatically, but there are some modules and some connectors that are no longer the same as they used to be. And that's something that I also offer. But on the other hand, as I already said, I'm using the Vaadin framework a lot. And I'm also offering in kind of, if you want to start your first Vaadin project, I will help you with that. So I will tell you what are the pitfalls, what you shouldn't do, how you should do it, and try to enable the customer to get started with the project. And the last thing that I do is just training. So I do usually in-house training for developers on different topics, Spring Boot, architecture, patterns, something like that. Or software development with AI. That's something that I did recently because this became very popular. And so I'm bringing them knowledge from the outside that they may not have in turn.
Very good. And do you need to reach out to companies, or they usually would reach out to you?
So as I said, very often I check where people are going, or when I meet people at conferences, I try to figure out if they need something or if they have problems where I could be of help. On the other hand, I get some customers contact me, usually existing companies, usually as well, to get my help, for example, or to get a new, or to help them teach someone. I also have a network with other freelancers or consultants, so I also often can recommend someone else. By the way, that's also a very good thing. You should try to find other consultants, and because you're usually as a one-man show, you're too small for certain companies because they prefer to have a team, for example, of developers. And if you can team up with other consultants, for example, consultants that you know from other projects or from other companies, for example, where you were working, or from a meetup, wherever you meet them, these people, you could form kind of a team and then offer the whole team to your customer.
Nice. And in this group of consultants, are they only from Switzerland or they are worldwide?
Currently, they are worldwide. So before pandemic, it
Nice.
was really just Switzerland because, or also before pandemic, or before, let's say, 15 years, we didn't had a lot of cloud computing. So the most of the applications were running on premise in the data center of the customer. So you didn't have access. Even if you would have to, you couldn't go into the network of your customer. Now this totally changed. First of all, usually people are able to work remotely. And so it doesn't matter where the customer really is. And the customer, or that the applications very often also run in the cloud. So you have access to the applications anyway, so you don't need to access a special network, for example. And as I said, I have currently customers in Switzerland. Most of them, I have a customer in Mexico and one in the United States. And from time to time, I also have customers in Germany or in Belgium. So The problem that I have more or less is Switzerland is a very expensive country. And so the problem are the rates, right? So the price is usually a problem to go worldwide as a Swiss consultant. But these projects of the customers in other countries are usually very specialized. So they really need a special know-how, or they want to, for example, the customer that I currently have from the United States is also doing something with Vaadin, and they wanted to start as fast as possible. So the price is not that important. It's more the time to the first version of your application or the kind of a minimal viable product. So they were eager to spend more money on that if they are faster, right? So then the price isn't really an issue. But in my case, really the price of Swiss consultant limits the range of customers or the countries where I usually work.
Makes sense because Switzerland, as far as I know, is a country who pays the most in Europe. So the rates you have to definitely charge a lot.
Yeah,
So
Switzerland is very expensive, so the rates are very high. Yeah, that's true.
very good. So do you have a team under you or it's only you doing the consultancy work?
Yeah, I had a team or kind of a small team a few years back. Currently, I don't have a team, but I'm working with other consultants. So I have a network here in Switzerland. So if someone asks, for example, for database administration work or engineering, platform engineering work, I know people in my network who can work for them. Sometimes they work for me or something. They work directly for the client. I also have other consultants in Europe that I often work together. So if I have an international customer, to lower the price, especially then I work with developers from mainly Eastern Europe, for example, that I sometimes know already for a very long time. And based on my network, I could also kind of supply a whole team to my customer if that's needed.
Oh, that's amazing. But they work for you as freelancers or the
Yes,
company you are consultants, they would hire your team.
sometimes, yes. So I had a project at Swiss government where I had people working for me in my team that was completely different. It was not software engineering. It was about middleware engineering back in the days where we had the application servers. But then I had a team that was working for the customer.
Oh, that's amazing. I really like the freedom you have as a consultant because when you have a company, it's a bit different because you have to start hiring people and you are expanding. And obviously it's kind of different. And as a consultant, you get to work on the technical side, solving real problems from companies. And you don't need to have a huge team under you. You can work from company to company. So it's really interesting because, this is the next level of a senior software developer, right? There's some routes a senior software developer can take. A senior could become like a tech lead or a manager, right? A manager or could go up to CTO or CEO or whatever, or they could have their own business, or they could be consultants, or they could maybe just teach other developers as well. So there are many, many routes, but it's very interesting, this route of being a consultant, because obviously as a consultant, your potential to earn more is a lot higher than being a senior software developer for a company because you have the freedom of negotiating your rate. And obviously, the more specialized you are, the more you can charge because the company needs someone with your expertise and they are willing to pay a lot. They don't care. They just want their problem to be solved. And if they know that you can solve their problems, you can really charge whatever you want, basically, because if you are like the only person in the world, not obviously not the only, but one of the few developers in the world who are specializing in this niche, they want you. And that's very interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, that's also the one reason because why I'm a consultant, because you can imagine after 13 years with the same companies, so Swiss Railways, at the end I was more or less a people manager, no longer software engineer. So the last title that I had at Swiss Railways was Master Software Architect. So I was in the software architecture board of Swiss Railways, or in the architecture board responsible for the software architecture for the whole railway company. And you can imagine I didn't write a line of code back then, maybe some prototyping or stuff like that. But usually I had to deal with my team because I was responsible for a team. So I had to do all the people management stuff. And on the other hand, I was involved in politics because there is a lot of, where people are coming together and you have to manage people and stuff like that. That's politics. That's no longer engineering work. And that's also a reason why I left Swiss Railways, because I want to go back to engineering. And if you're a consultant, then you can choose which field you want to work on. And as I said, or as you said, and that's 100% the point, if you become an expert in a certain field or in a niche, then this works. If you just say, okay, I want to be a Java developer and to be a consultant and do Java development, then you will not, maybe you would not even get the project, because this is very hard, because the competition is a lot. So you have millions of developers or thousands of consultants also in Switzerland that are able to do simple Java development work. And you also have the competition in other countries. So other countries can do that cheaper maybe. And so you really should look at something that is, because also if you want to, as we talked before, if you want to talk about that or write about that, you need something that you can focus on, and you can't know everything. So that's simply impossible. You need to know, or you need to have a broad knowledge. That's for sure. So you need to know the concepts, how things work together. So things that you learn if you go to the university, for example, or to any other trainings, then you will learn about distributed systems or stuff. So you need that, but you can't be expert in everything. And so if you find something that is really unique for you, then it will happen exactly what you said. So you will get hired by companies because of your knowledge.
Amazing. And in your opinion, what are the most important skills for a consultant?
And I would say you need to like to work with people. So, I mean, there are also consultants that are just doing programming, right? But usually you will be in contact with a lot of people. First of all, you need to get to someone who needs someone, then you need to talk to them to find out what they really need. Then you need to create an offer. You need to be able to kind of sell your offer to the customer, negotiate the price, as you said before. Then you will come to a team, and very often you come to a team that is not waiting for you. And maybe your assignment will be to improve the team skills. And sometimes the team thinks, why is this person coming to our team? We have a lot of knowledge. We know what we are doing. Why does someone think that we are not performing well? And that is very difficult, because you have to have a lot of social skills to figure out a way how to train people, coach people, without telling them that you think their work is not good. You know what I mean? Because that's also something that I do. So companies, for example, software development managers are reaching out and say, hey, my team is slow, how we can get faster. And the team usually doesn't think that they are slow. It's an outside view, and then you have to find what the problems are. You have to train the people, you have to coach the people, and that's a lot of social contacts and social skills, and has absolutely nothing to do with software engineering.
And I really dislike the manager who does that, because this is not your work. Well, at least I think it shouldn't be your work. It should be the work of a manager, right? The manager should explain to his or her team what's going on. It's not only, hey, Simon, come over here, solve my problem. I don't need to do my job here. I don't need to deal with people. You tell him, you tell my team, okay, you do my job. You tell my team that they are slow. That's ridiculous. I think the manager is not doing their job, because that's the main goal of a manager. Like, how can a manager talk to you and say, hey, Simon, come here, solve all my problems, and I don't need to tell my team that they are slow? That's ridiculous. If the manager is not able to tell their team that they are slow, he or she is not a manager. I don't know what they're doing there. For me, this is ridiculous. And it doesn't make any sense. And it makes the job so much more difficult for you, because it could be a lot easier if the manager who is inside, who is there, who is working with the team, if they let their team know that you are coming to help them improve code quality, to whatever, they don't need to give a specific reason, oh, you're slow. They could say, oh, you're going to improve your software process or whatever. But when you reach to them, and I think that's,
Usually that the manager doesn't know why they're slow. And usually there are two reasons. First reason is the team doesn't really understand the software they are working on. That's the most of the case, because, as I said, there are not a lot of greenfield projects. Usually you are assigned in maintenance of some application. And that's also a very important skill, by the way. If you want to be a consultant, you should be very good at reading code. So writing code is not that important. So that's a bit a silly thing. But the point is, usually you have to read much more code than you write. And what I do then, by the way, if the team is slow in that case, that they really don't understand what the application is happening, I do the same as I told you before about modernization, because you have to kind of step back and look from a different perspective on the application to understand what it really does. Because you cannot understand an application from the code. That doesn't work. You only understand an application from the user perspective, or the perspective of an API, or the perspective of kind of batch processing. Doesn't matter, but you can't look at a single class or a package and then understand what this does. That's just what's written, but that's probably not the problem that it solves, right? You know what I mean? So you really need to understand the business case. And that's usually also why they are slow. But that's something that it depends a bit on the manager, because there are managers they're fine because they once been also software developers. So they understand their team or the duty of the team, what they're doing, the work. But there are also managers, they have no clue because they are just managers, right?
okay, I understand the problem. There is kind of a trust issue, and they are hiring you because they fully trust you to tell him or her if their team are fooling him or her or not.
For example.
Okay. So in that context, it makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. So it's not the manager that has a problem and doesn't want to solve it, but he needs a solution how to make the team faster. And usually making the team faster is enabling the team to understand what they're working on, because usually it's not really the programming skills. It's more the skill of understanding existing code, the skill of understanding the business, the skill of finding a way to know the code. Today it's maybe a bit simpler because you could take some AI and feed them your code and say, tell me what it does. And then probably the AI will say, okay, that's doing that, and maybe you're faster in learning code. But this also can only tell you what's inside the code, but it doesn't tell you what the purpose of your piece of code that you're currently looking on is. And that's probably really a skill. So to match the business side with the code side somehow. And it really doesn't matter if you're doing domain-driven design or not, or something else. That's not the problem. The problem is really kind of a skill. And I don't know, but I think that's maybe a bit forgotten in the last few decades. Because, when I started for 30 years ago, we just had a software developer, someone from the business side, and someone from operations. And the person from business side said, hey, I need kind of new form where I can enter certain data. And you as a developer, you did the analysis, you did the design, you did the implementation. And when you're done, you said, operations guy, hey, put it in production. And first of all, this was very agile and this was very fast. And then somehow, in my case, around 2000, 2002, 2003, we had a movement away from this multi-purpose software engineer to a more specialized software engineer. So we introduced like requirements engineers, we introduced business analysts, and they were doing the work that before the software engineer did. And so you had someone who was talking with the business people and they came back with a model or use cases or stories or stuff. And then the developers were just advised to implement that. But if you do that like this, then the engineer is missing a lot of information, because the process of gathering requirements is very, very important to understand what you're building. So if you as an engineer are not involved in the requirements phase, you will have knowledge problem because you don't know what the user really wants. You just know what the business analyst writes in a paper, what he wants to have implemented, and this doesn't work. That's my opinion. You really, really need to be involved in this discussion. At least one person from the team, for example, always need to be involved in business decisions or in business requirements, workshops or stuff like that. You need to understand the business, and you cannot understand that if you get it from a person that is not really the person that is requesting or the person who will use that by the end. That's a really problem. That's also why I said you should go to the store and work with the people to understand what they're doing. And that's the same. So I mean, business analysts and requirements engineers are very important because they need to get in touch, get the first ID. But during the whole software development process, you need to be part of that, of the thing. You need to know what people are doing with your software by the end. And if you're working for certain companies, especially for large companies, they have a really hard border between the people that are, or the roles in the project. And they get, at the end, they are just assigned some tickets and have to do some tickets without thinking why they are doing that.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting to be able to work besides the user, because I understand the software flow, but as you said, in most companies, that's not possible. So my question to you in this case is, how do you improve the skill of learning the business?
I think, so first of all, as I said, you should try to find something in the industry you like. So maybe you already know something about that, right? So for example, my son likes to do mountain biking. So he knows everything about bikes, and he could work as a software engineer for a bike company because he already knows what they're doing more or less, right? So that's an easy step. If you're coming to a company in an industry where you have no clue about that, for example, if I would go to an insurance company, I have no idea how insurance are built. I know how to buy insurance, but I have no clue how they are building insurance, why they price a certain insurance with a certain price. I have no clue. And then you really need to find someone who can explain that to you, but not in a detail, because if I had that many times in my career, I come to an existing application and then someone starts to explain me the software, but very detailed. And I say, hey, that's useless because I can't figure out what you're telling me because I don't know where to put that in the whole process of what your company does. So you really should find either you have someone like in many companies you have kind of a process manager who is responsible for the process because depending on the company, maybe they have some standards that they have to fulfill. So their process has to be standardized in a certain way. And then you will find maybe some overall process, but maybe you should go or try to ask if there is someone in the company or in the software development team who can explain the business from like for someone who has no clue about the company, right? So, and on a level, like if you would explain what your company does or what your software does to a school kid, for example. And this really helps. So if you get this overall view and you know what they are doing, then you can maybe have a mental map around this process and the model. And then it's much easier to dig into a specific code or, in which step of the process, for example, this application is used for, then you know what's happening there. So you should really try to do that because I very often come to new projects and then there's some lead engineer or the development manager or even a tester or some person, and they're trying to explain the software in details. They show me the application and say, here, you can enter that and this and that, and say, okay, I can do that, but why? Why should I do that? And so you really have to find a way to get that. And if you have good documentation, by the way, I mean, all kinds of ideas how to document software architecture have the same pattern. They try to create views of the software. So you have architecture views, you have deployment views, you have process views, you have security or database views. And these views helps to get an understanding of the software from different perspectives, from different stakeholders. And if you have that, then you're fine. But if you don't have that, then you may have a problem.
Yeah, in most companies, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
And in most projects that I have, I know the knowledge is in the head of a single person usually, or maybe two. And they know that by heart because they're working for a very long time for the company, but that you have no pictures, no documents, and there's no help. So you need to get them to explain it to you. And then you should draw an image or a picture of they tell you. And maybe this picture can then be used for other developers to get a better understanding of the software.
Yeah, and this is the case for most of the companies. They don't create any documentation. And you have to ask one or two developers. And the other skill you mentioned that is crucial is to know how to ask. Because like you said, if they start telling you all the details of the software, it will be useless because it's so much details and you don't even know the macro view of the system. So it's going to be kind of a useless meeting. So you have to know how to lead this discussion with those developers or managers or stakeholders so that you really understand the business requirements. And this is very connected to communication skills. And it's one of the most important skills for more experienced developers, because if you have poor communication skills and you hear lots of things about the details of the software and you go out of that meeting knowing nothing about the business, it's your fault, right? So how can you solve the problem if you don't understand what's the problem? So the skill of making the right questions to understand requirements, understand the problem, it's a crucial skill for any intermediate or senior Java developer. Very
yes,
good.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Yeah.
And you've been working very closely with Vaadin. You've been giving lots of talks about Vaadin as well. So can you briefly explain the pros and cons of this incredible Java framework?
Yeah, the pros is that if you are a Java developer, and no, I start differently. If you're doing kind of full stack development, and you really want to do that because there are several reasons to do full stack development. First of all, if your team is very small or your customer is very small, then you don't have a front end team, you don't have a back end team, you just have a development team. And then if you want to be able to also work in different areas of the application, you have to do full stack. And by full stack, I really only mean the front end and the back end side. I don't talk about the platform engineering, DevOps, stuff like that, because very often people also think that's part of full stack development. I just talk about client and server application and database. And if you have like traditional business applications, they are usually data centric, means you have a lot of database tables, you have a lot of forms, you have usually not a lot of users, because these are back office applications used by the business of your application, not by the end customer of your application. So for example, if you have an e-commerce system, I talk about applications that you use to manage the products, to manage the users, to fix problems with the orders, for example, to do logistics, stuff like, and these are all the same. You usually have kind of a grid, you have a form with data binding where the user enters data and saves the data, it will directly save the database. And for that kind of applications, it's much better if you do the use case or the feature from front end to back end, because this will be the more consistent solution and the better solution. Otherwise, if for example, a backend team is creating the backend with a certain API, and then a sprint later, for example, the UI team is starting, they will figure out that the API doesn't fit the requirements, for example. And usually they don't go to the backend and fix the API. They create certain workarounds on the client side, for example. And that's a bad thing. So you should really, if your application is not that complicated in terms, it's not a customer-facing application, it's not a mobile application, for example, it's not a website, it's really kind of a business application, full stack development is better. And with Vaadin, you can do the whole application in Java. For sure, there are some parts where you need some CSS knowledge or even some JavaScript, but not the whole team needs that knowledge. It's okay if just one person in the whole company knows that, because they can do that for your exact problem, and the rest of the application can really be done just with Java. And Vaadin is also perfect because it has great components. It has a grid that is very convenient. You have sorting, filtering, you can move the columns of the application, you have drag and drop support, everything you need. And with that, you are very fast in building that type of applications. And that's why I like the framework, by the way, because most of the applications that I'm doing are in many parts exactly like that.
That's very interesting. You have even drag and drop with Vaadin.
Yeah, it's all encapsulated. You can say, okay, that's my drag source, that's my drop target, and then the user can drag the source to a drop target, and that's it. You don't need to do anything, and the event handling will be in plain Java. So you don't have to write a single line of JavaScript code.
Wow. So this means that any Java developer can write a full script without the need to know of the JavaScript, jQuery, the CSS. Oh, that's amazing.
So my job is usually as a Vaadin expert, I help them to build the base component. So maybe they have some custom components that they need, or we can even create some higher order components that exactly fit how they work. So they just can instantiate the class and pass, for example, the repository, and then the grid is already done. So on that level, right? And also the theming is perfect. You can very simple adjust all the CSS and look and feel to the CI/CD from your company. For example, change the logo, change the colors, change the font, change radius, change everything. That's very, very simple. And you can, the best because it's Java, you just can create a base library, and then you can deploy the library to a main repo, and every application can use that. And if the company changed the main color, for example, so we have company A that had red as the main color and says, oh no, blue is nicer, then you change just the dependency, and if every project updates the Maven dependency, the application looks in the new style. And that's really great. So I really like that. Because, when I started as a Java developer, we all learned UI development. We had AWT first and then Swing, and we did applications with that. And so the older Java developers probably still know that. I don't know what they teach at university, if they are teaching JavaFX or if they just omit the UI part in the Java courses. But if you know how to build UIs with no matter which UI library, even if it's C# or if it's Java, for example, you can build UIs with Vaadin, because you will find similar components like a text field, a button, something like that, and then you have to go. It's really simple.
That's amazing. So Vaadin is not only front end, it has everything. It's front end and back end, right?
In fact, Vaadin is only front end, but it integrates with every framework. So the best integration is with Spring Boot, because Spring Boot is the most used backend framework. So there you have direct integration with role-based security, for example, with Spring Security, or direct integration with Spring Data repositories, for example. But because Vaadin is only servlet, so Vaadin, as every web framework, implements the front controller pattern. So you can use this Vaadin servlet also with Quarkus or with Micronaut or directly in a Jakarta EE server. It really doesn't matter. So it can be used everywhere where Java runs and where a servlet container is available.
That's amazing. It seems like Vaadin is an evolution of GSF.
Not exactly, but it's very similar. So the similarity between Jakarta Faces and Vaadin is that both are component-based. So in contrast to Timeleaf, for example, or any other of this MVC, we also have MVC with Jakarta E, for example. So Jakarta MVC, they are template-based. So you have request-response model, and you don't have any components, right? You use HTML, and then you loop over a list of objects and create database rows. With JSF and Vaadin, you don't do that, because you have a data table or a grid in case of Vaadin, and you just say, hey, that's my data. And then you define which columns you have, but you don't have to iterate yourself because the component is iterating over the data. And that's very much the most important difference. And in my opinion, for business applications, a component-based approach for UIs is much better than a template-based approach. Template-based approach is fine if you're creating websites, or if you're creating your own blog, or you're creating like a simple form to get some information about the user, for example, if you have something or whatever. But if you really want to build applications where you have complex components, then you need a component-based framework. So you can also use Jakarta Faces, especially with Prime Faces, because the Prime Faces library is amazing. They have many great components, but still Vaadin is simpler. And the difference is also Jakarta Faces or Prime Faces has its own component model, whereas Vaadin is relying on the web component standard. So each Vaadin component is a web component, means you can also use the Vaadin web components outside of Vaadin. So you can use, for example, pure JavaScript and use the web components from Vaadin. And Vaadin also has, for example, a React wrapper around their components, so you can directly use the web components in a React application.
Wow, it's amazing. I really like that because I used to work with JSF. I worked with JSF for quite a while. And what I really disliked about JSF was how difficult it was to create new components. Like it was almost impossible because you didn't have any freedom. Well, you kind of had, but you had to do a huge workaround to create new components, and it didn't work very well because you have all the JSF phases. It's very strict, I would say, a strict framework, and you have to follow what they have there. If you're going out of what components they have, then you're going to have a lot of work. I remember when we had to create new components, it was so difficult to create only one component. So
Yeah, and styling is also very hard. So if you want to change the style of your JSF application, that's also a lot of work because you have to exactly know how the framework works, and that's difficult. With Vaadin, it's very simple. You create a web component because Vaadin works like that you have, or you create the UI on the backend side. So you have Java classes. So each web component has a Java representation, and you create that and you add that to the UI. And then there is communication between the backend and the front end. And on the front end side, you have a framework called Vaadin Flow. And Flow is responsible for rendering the component. So that means you have on runtime, a Vaadin application is a single page application. So you have the first load of the page, and then you have a single page that is Vaadin Flow is doing the communication. If you hit the button, for example, this gets a request. It will be applied to the component model on the server side, and then the diff will be transferred to the client. So it's similar to JSF a bit, but very different. And because it's web component based and Java based, if you need a new component that does not exist, just create your own web component because that's a standard. You need some JavaScript and HTML template for it. And then you need to write a Java class that is integrating the web component into the Vaadin Flow framework, and you're done. That's very, very simple. And most of the time, you don't need to create your own web components because there are thousands of web components available in the internet that you can use and integrate.
wow, sounds amazing. Sounds amazing. And definitely it's a great framework for developers who don't, I know that most Java developers don't like the front end, but with Vaadin, it's really fun.
I really like front-end development, not because of the front-end development, but because you can see something, right? So if you're
Yeah.
just working on the back-end side, you don't see anything. So you don't have to show anything to somebody. You cannot show your SQL query to the user. You could do that, but he says, okay, what's that? I don't mind. It's irrelevant to me. But as a front end or as a full stack developer, you could directly work with the business people. So you can say, hey, do you like my work? And they said, and you get immediate feedback from them. They say, oh, I don't like it, or I like it. It's great. It helps us. And that's very satisfying, So if you get feedback from the person who is using your stuff or your application, then at least for me, that's very satisfying to get feedback for my work.
Yeah, me too. I also really like the front end. But I know that from talking with many developers, I know they usually don't like the front end.
Yeah, I think they don't like it, especially because the JavaScript frameworks that we have are very complicated. So some of them are simpler, some of them are more complicated. But if you're a Java developer and need to learn, for example, Angular, you need to learn a lot. So you need to learn the framework, you need to know the concepts of the framework, you need to know the build system, because it's not Maven or Gradle, it's something else. You need to know NPM, so it's a different repository for your dependencies. There are other rules in that ecosystem, so they work with version ranges, something that we never would do in the Java field because we always want to strict limit the dependency on a certain version, and we don't like to have a version ranges. And so you have two ecosystems. It's not only because the simplest thing is two programming languages. But a programming language to learn is not that hard. You can just learn a new one, and then you know a new one. But then it comes with frameworks, with libraries, with build tools, with stuff like that. And that's way more complicated. And this takes a long time to get familiar with that. And you cannot catch up with both ecosystems. That's probably not possible because I try to do that. I also can write TypeScript code and I can create a React application probably if you ask me. But I don't feel that when doing that work because I'm not sure if I really do it right, And on the Java side, I'm convinced that I know exactly how it works and what I'm.
Yeah, I remember there was a friend of mine who really disliked working with Angular because I think he said to his manager, they really want me to work with Angular because I will perform like a junior in Angular. So I think you're right. I think that's the reason why most Java developers don't like the front end, because it's another whole platform. It's different concepts. So they dislike because they won't perform as well as they would perform with Java. Okay. So you are also a lecturer. So can you share a little bit of your experience as a lecturer and what subjects you are currently teaching to them?
Yeah. So the funny thing is, when I transitioned from COBOL to Java, I was going back to the university to do some continuing education courses. So there was kind of studies that you could do it, and it was called Software School in Switzerland. Back then, it was part of university. It was a program to, first of all, to move people, engineers from other fields like electronic engineers or machine industry to software engineering. And I did that because it was a good fit, because we were learning object-oriented development with C#, C++, and C. And then later on, we were learning Java. And I also did like a diploma thesis at the end of the studies. Expert of my thesis was the manager of the school back in the days. And I had a topic in my diploma thesis. It was called Java Connector Architecture, JCA. Maybe you know that. It's part of Jakarta E. And the purpose is to integrate other systems, like, for example, an SAP system or a host system into Java application. And my work or my project was to integrate IBM WebSphere or IBM Mainframe, into IBM WebSphere. So that's probably exactly what I did. First COBOL, then Java, and that was my thesis. And after that, the manager of the school came to me and asked me if I could do or integrate that as a few lessons in the course to teach the Java developers JCA. So that was the first time in 2001 when I did my first lectures. And then I had a break, and it was about 2006. They were looking for someone teaching Java Persistence API. And they asked me if I could do that because they knew that I was responsible for OR mapping at Swiss Railways back then, because we had a different framework. It was called TopLink. Maybe you remember that. It was from the object people initially with Smalltalk in 1995 and then moved to Java. And finally, now it's Eclipse Link, but it's a complete rewrite. It's no longer the TopLink source that we had back then. So I started to teach JPA in a course at the university that was called Enterprise Application Development with Java E. So it was exactly Java E, so Java E5, which came out in 2005. And I started to teach in 2007 with that course. And later on, we changed from Java E to Spring Boot. So I was teaching Spring Boot. I was always teaching also the architecture and design style. So how do we build applications, especially later on with microservices, how we build distributed applications like architecture things, but also all the microservice patterns, reliability, like circuit breaking and stuff like that. And a few years ago, I also started at another university teaching DevOps for business informatics students. So that's in bachelor studies. And I just tell them what DevOps means. And we are doing kind of a small application or some microservices to deploy them finally on Kubernetes, that they see how kind of modern software engineering could look like. So that's not really a lot of hands-on. It's more getting into the concepts. But I'm mainly teaching architecture and design of distributed systems at the university.
Nice, which is a huge topic.
Yeah, you
Very
can
good.
do that. There are so many different architecture styles. There are so many patterns, so many technology that you can integrate into the lesson. That's really great. Yeah.
Awesome. In your perspective, what Java technologies do you think it's the most important for Java developers to learn nowadays?
That, in my opinion, this depends a bit on the field you're working in, and depends also probably on the region where you're working. So
Mhm.
that's something that's very interesting. For example, in Switzerland, if you look at the companies, and if you're looking at primarily banks and insurance companies, government, or these retailers or wholesale companies, they are more or less traditionally Java EE and later on transition to Spring Boot. So that's the usual stack that they have. So if you want to get into such a company, you really should know kind of how Spring works a bit. And this helps because every framework is the same. So it really not a lot of difference between Java EE, Spring, and Quarkus. The difference is between these three types, or even we could use Micronaut or any other framework. The concepts are similar. You know, you have dependency injection, you have like proxies, you have interceptors, you have integration of persistence, messaging, and other frameworks. And so you can move from one framework to another if you are familiar with the concepts. So I'm also teaching Spring Boot. So the first thing that I do with them is explaining them dependency injection, and we create a dependency injection framework together, very small, because the core is very simple. So we don't do cycle detection, right? We just do it simple, but it's really not difficult to do that in the first place. So the core is very sleek and very, very simple, but it helps to understand how the frameworks work. So you should get an idea how one of these dependency injection framework works. It doesn't really matter if the framework is doing compile time or runtime injection, because that's an implementation detail which has some impacts. For example, if you want to do native images, but it really doesn't matter in terms of the usage of the framework, right? And the other thing that you should learn, what's currently very important also for newer, or what a bit changed, is event-driven styles. So I see a lot of projects that are using event-driven integration between microservices, for example, or application parts, so to say. Kafka is very popular. Sometimes Kafka is not needed. They could use traditional messaging, by the way, like we did 20 years ago with JMS, but they like Kafka because Kafka is modern, so we do it with Kafka. And you should really learn, you don't need to understand Kafka fully in terms of how to operate it, but you should learn about messaging concepts, what are messagings, what are consumers, what are producers, what messaging styles do we have, stuff like that. And if you really understand the concepts, you understand Kafka, you understand JMS, you understand any other messaging type. And the same goes for databases. You should learn for sure SQL databases, also kind of how you integrate that. Not matter if it's JPA, if it's Jooq, if it's plain JDBC, but you should know how you can access that, how SQL works. And then you also know maybe a bit how NoSQL databases work. Because many NoSQL databases also have a kind of a SQL dialect to access the data nowadays, but you should also look at the different styles. I mean, you should also look at, do we have a document type store? Do we have a relational store? Do we have a column-oriented store? And that's are again concepts and not implementation details. You should know the concepts of the various types. I mean, today we have multi-purpose databases like Oracle 23 AI has a document store, it has a relation store, it has a graph database store. So you get many of these concepts, and you should really think about which one would work best. And the good thing is, no matter what you're using, if you're using Jakarta, you have Jakarta data that does an abstraction over that. You have Spring data, you have Quarkus data, you have every framework has a kind of a data abstraction, but that you don't need to know that, but you should know how, what in behind the scenes at least works. So I would say like messaging patterns, database store types, and how to access these systems is something that's important.
And what about cloud vendors, container technologies?
This depends a bit of the company. So there are companies where you need to know a lot, even from the operations, what happens behind the scenes. Then you should, you should know what the container is, right? You should know what an image is, how you start a container. you should also be familiar about the concepts. Now we have 20 containers running. Maybe we need some container orchestration, what kind of Kubernetes is doing. Even there on a conceptual side, you don't need to know that in details, because you probably will find someone in the company who knows that, or hopefully you will find someone in the company who knows that if they're operating Kubernetes. And it really depends a bit, right? I mean, database-wise, there are big differences between SQL databases. So Oracle database is different from Postgres and different from MySQL, for example. But it really depends which level you are. So do you really need or want to use the special features that the database provides? Or are you more on an abstract level where you say, no, I want to change the database? By the way, no one does that, right? So I had 2 projects in my career where we were changing from Oracle Postgres database. This was mainly money driven. They wanted to save license costs. But other than that, you don't do that. And so if you really want to use everything from the platform you get and you may pay for, you really should look maybe also in vendor-specific stuff. For example, in the database or your platform runtime, because this could make things simpler for you.
Very good. And you also mentioned about Jooq. So can you explain why you use Jooq and what are the main benefits of using it?
Yeah, the problem is very old. The problem we already had on COBOL programs, we want to write SQL, and now we need to have a string with a SQL state. If the database changes, our code will no longer run. If we don't have any tests, we will find it out in production. So the first thing that Jooq does, it integrates SQL into Java. Means it has a DSL, and the DSL from Jooq is similar to SQL. So you have select from and where and stuff like that. And on the other hand, you have a meta model generator. So if you're familiar with JPA, you know the meta model generator from JPA that is creating a meta model that you can use in your criteria API query. And Jooq does more or less the same, but on the database side. So it uses the database meta model or dictionary and creates a Jooq meta model for your database. So you will get the class per table, you will get constants for the table name, for the fields, similar to the meta model from JPA. And then you can use these constants directly in your Jooq DSL. And if you change the database, for example, you rename the table, your code will no longer compile because the class has also changed. And that's a big benefit, because then you are sure that your query syntactically is correct. So without running a test. For sure, you have to run tests to see if you get the right data, but you don't have to write tests to see if your SQL statement is correct. And that's a big difference. That's another level. And having SQL in string is really sometimes a problem, because you will not notice problem and not notice changes. But even if you want to create, for example, dynamic queries, so you have a search form and then you, depending on what the user enters, have a different where condition in your query, this is very hard. So if you have to combine the parts of your strings and then form a SQL statement, then this is very difficult to do. So you could use criteria API, which would make it simpler if you use Hibernate, but criteria API is a very complicated API, so I don't like to use that. And the other thing is, if you're doing manually string concatenation, you could have SQL injection if you do not use parameters all over. And Jooq always uses parameter or prepared statements. So you will never have SQL injection with Jooq. And that's also a big benefit of using Jooq. And I like SQL, by the way, because SQL is declarative programming, like we do it since Java 8 with lambdas, for example, and Stream API. And so it's a bit of a mind shift, because you don't have to tell SQL or the database what to do. You say just what you need. So you declare what you need, and then how it is fetched from the database, it's on the database level. So you don't have to care about that. And that's sometimes a bit difficult, especially for beginners, because if they start programming, they know, okay, we have an if, we have a for loop or a while loop, and we can loop and filter stuff out and move it to another collection stuff like we were programming before we had streams. And so SQL is kind of similar to streams. So I really like that we have streams now because we also can declare like what we want to do with the data and do not have to power stuff.
So Jooq will basically connect the database to the Java code.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and yeah, I really didn't like very much the criteria API. It's even worse, the JPA criteria API, because so complicated, it makes the codes so bad. The Hibernate criteria is a bit better, a bit simpler, but the one from the JPA specification is horrible.
Yeah,
so I don't know, maybe nowadays it's a little bit better, but I remember huge code I have to create for dynamic queries and wasn't good.
I think that the problem is a bit that the design is, how should I say, too academic. That's the first problem. And the second problem of the criteria API and JPA specification is it's not fluent. And Jooq is fluent. So you really need write select, and you can say which fields you want to have or which columns, then from which table, where, and then you add stuff. And because it's fluent, each step in your query can be extracted. So if you always have the same projection, just extract that in a method. Or if you have parts in the where condition that you need or want to reuse, just create a constant, for example, in your code. And so you can mix and match and combine. And with criteria API, you have a lot of intermediate steps. So you write a query, then you get the root object, then you make a join, then you get the join object, and finally you have to combine that and create a query out of it. That's very, very difficult to do. And so I really prefer the fluency of the Jooq API.
So with Jooq, you can also write the SQL code once, and you can change to any database you want?
Yep.
Oh, that's incredible. So yeah, that really helps if you want to change from one database to the other.
Yeah, Jooq is even emulating features that may not be present in your current database.
Wow.
So if you know Oracle, for example, Oracle has hierarchic queries with connect by. So we can specify how the rows in the table are connected to form a tree. And that's not available in other languages or other database SQL languages. And the Jooq will then go ahead and say, okay, he wants connect by, but he's using MariaDB. Let's figure out how we can do a hierarchical query with MariaDB. So it emulates features, for example, that are not natively available. Maybe sometimes it's not very good because the performance could be not as good as if you have it with a database that is natively supporting that. But at least your code will be portable. So you can move from one database to another if you really want to do that. So, but I don't like to do that, especially what people were doing mostly was using H2 database or HSQL before to do integration tests with an in-memory database. I'm very happy that we have containers and test containers that we don't need to do that anymore, because there are always differences between the database types in terms of performance, in terms of support functionality, in terms of behavior of the database, depending on what you're doing with the database. And if you're not testing against the same database as you have in production, you're not testing the real code. That's the problem. And so test containers very much helps. And I would say most of the databases, even Oracle database in the newest version, starts very fast. So it starts in about like 30 seconds, maybe 20 seconds, depending on your computer. For sure, if you have Postgres, for example, which starts in under a second, then you're way better off. So I would say Postgres and test containers may even start faster than H2 in memory, but I didn't measure that. But it's at least on the same level. So there's no reason to use H2 anymore for that purpose. And that really helps. And then if you have Jooq and test containers, you also can generate the meta model from example from a test containers database. So you don't need a database running to generate the code. You just spin up the test container and then you generate the code.
Amazing. And changing the subject a little bit, let's talk about AI. So AI is taking the world by storm. So in your opinion, what are the AI subjects Java developers should learn nowadays?
It depends a bit on if you want to use AI as a developer to write code or to write documentation or write anything, or to understand your code, or if you want to use AI to integrate in your application. So let's start with
developers.
We are developers, right?
Yeah.
So I would say, I was testing JetBrains Junai lately. So they had an early access program. Now I think it's public now. It's not free, by the way. But I have no clue what it costs, but I was able to test it for free. And I was also using Windsurf before. That's also kind of an agentic AI. So it's different from what we had before. AI was more or less the same as you did with ChatGPT. You just tell AI what you want to have, and then it returns certain result, right? So it depends on your prompt. But with the new tools that are really agentic means you say something that you need what to have. You can configure what maybe how it behaves. It depends on what you supply as prompt and additional information. And then the agent does everything by its own. And that's really impressive in the first time when you use it. But as a senior developer, it's very annoying because it's very slow still, right? Because what happens then, for example, I use Spring Boot and say, okay, create me database table, employee, then create me a repository. I need a REST controller with an API, create open API and create tests. And then everything will happen by its own. But to me, this feels currently like a junior developer. So I tell some junior developer do that, and then I get back a result certain time later, maybe with AI faster than with the junior developer, depending how fast the junior developer is. But then I have to review the whole code. So currently I do not trust the result because I think it's not in a stage where it's really good as I would write it or any other senior developer would write it. And now the question is, does this really save time? I mean, AI, even if it's ChatGPT or Claude AI or Mistral or anything else, really helps all the junior developers because you can ask something and you don't have to ask Google, because before we just used Google and it returned some Stack Overflow answers maybe, and then we had to figure out if this is correct or if that's something that we need. Now we just use AI for the same purpose and we get the result. And sometimes it's very helpful. I mean, I use it as well. For example, if I have to do some Spring security configuration, which is also not very easy to do, sometimes I get an ID back, right? And if it's integrated in the ID, in JetBrains, IntelliJ, or in Visual Studio Code, it doesn't really matter. Then I just get the code back and it compiles or it doesn't compile, right? I don't have to copy paste stuff back and forth. That helps. But the problem is I don't see that for a junior developer, this is much better than getting answers from Stack Overflow, because what I really recommend junior developers read the manuals. I mean, if you're using Jakarta EE, for example, and that's the reason why I really like Jakarta EE, you have specifications. And these specifications define how the framework really works. If the implementation then fully implements the specifications checked by a kit, test compatibility kit, to check if the implementation fulfills the requirements of the specification, so you can learn that. And if you know that, then it works. If you want to learn Spring Boot, then you should read the Spring Boot manual or the Spring Framework manual, because that's the source of truth. Everything that AI is telling you may be outdated, may be wrong simply. So maybe because AI will never tell you that it doesn't know how to do it. It just gives you an answer and you have to verify that. And now that's a bit of a problem for junior developers because writing code is simpler than reading code. And if you use AI to generate code, the thing that you do most then as a junior developer is read code. You don't write code anymore, you read it. And this requires some skills that are not that easy to achieve. So reading code, understanding code is very, very difficult and understand what it does. If you read it by hand, you can write line by line and try to understand each line you write. If you get a bunch of code from somewhere, even if you copy it from Stack Overflow or if it's generated by AI, you have to go through the code and understand or try to understand the code what it does. You shouldn't use it. You can use it as it is and don't care about if it's correct or not, but that shouldn't be done. So that's really, how should I say, it's a bit of a problem currently, especially then when the AI also generates the tests. Because then the AI tests what the AI generated, so it's always green, the test, hopefully, because it's a white box test. So the AI looks at the implementation, writes a test for the implementation. This should work, right? But that shouldn't be the way how you do tests. You should test the requirements and not the implementation. And that's my point of view of AI. I mean, it helps a lot. I use AI for writing. I use AI for architecture brainstorming. I use AI to do some silly returning work that I don't want to do 100 times. Stuff like that. For example, to generate me some test data or generate me. Meanwhile, we also can generate pictures. So generate me a picture of this code, for example, or something like that. That's really helpful. Or also try to explain me the code. And that's a skill set you need to develop, right? So I don't say that AI is not good. You should use it anyway, but you should learn how it behaves and what the results are. And it's very hard to keep up with the progress because if someone tells you today, hey, use Claude AI, Sonnet 3.5 or 3.7, that's the best model for programming. Tomorrow that could be another model that is maybe better. So you really should check what's going on in that field.
Yeah, for sure. To create good prompts is a skill. Or, when you're coding, you need to ask the right thing. You can't simply just throw code to AI and say, hey, solve that to me. Sometimes that works, but in more complicated cases, like when you want to create decent tests, you have to do a better job telling AI, hey, AI, I want you to test all of those use cases. The business is that, it's responsible to do that. I want you to test these specific business case scenarios. So you have to elaborate in the prompts, you can't just throw the code there and say, hey, create tests for me. Doesn't work like that.
I mean, we're exactly at the same point as before. You said that communication skills are very important. And that also includes how to answer a good question. And I mean, it was the same with Google. If you didn't know how to ask Google for information, you may also not be able to ask AI for help. So you really need to practice that and improve that, because the more information you give about your problem, then you probably also get better results.
That's true. That's true. And do you think AI will soon replace developers?
That's a good question. Currently, as far as I understand, a lot of managers think that. There was also kind of a manager from Amazon who told a few months ago probably that Amazon will need 25,000 developers less because AI will generate the code. Or some other people are trying to replace COBOL code today with AI to generate some other languages. I don't think that we are currently there and that this will work. And we were talking a lot about this topic already. I mean, communication skill, talking with people that have a problem or need software, that cannot be replaced currently, at least, by AI. AI can do, as I said, returning tasks. For example, I we were building a very small application for a customer. It was to manage some coupons so that they can sell or give coupons away to their customers that they get, for example, some percentage off or some money back. And I tried to generate that with AI. And this worked quite well. But when I look back at the process, I'm not sure if I was really faster than doing it manually. So if you really know very well what you're doing, AI is maybe not faster than you. So that really depends on what you're doing. And your code is better because it's your code. So it's better in terms of it's your code style. Because what's very important also is that the code style in a project is the same. Because if you look there, and I don't mean formatting. I mean really the code style, how you write stuff and what patterns you use, what architecture style, design, what you have in your application should be consistent. That helps to understand your code. And depending on how you're using AI, you probably get a mix of different styles in your application, and this will be hard to understand. And as far as we are currently with AI, the maintenance of the software and the testing must be done by developers still. So my problem more is how do we get senior developers in the future? Because usually the task for a junior developer, build a simple UI with a database table with some repository and a service and map them with Hibernate entities and stuff like that. This no longer needs to be done manually, right? So it's really the things that people do with who just started, and this will produce kind of, I don't know, a vacuum from people, from senior developers, if they cannot learn that way, right? I also see that with students because students usually use AI. I mean, that was very funny. I was teaching them domain-driven design. So just the concepts with bounded context and stuff. And then I told them, okay, now we have this domain. Try to figure out how the bounded context could look like and how the domain models in the bounded contexts could be. And one student came to me after an hour and told me, look, this picture was generated by AI. Is this what you're looking for? And then said, yeah, okay, more or less, but you should create it by your own because you have to think about that. And it's not just the drawing, it's the process, how you get to the model. And so the process, how to write software, and this will get lost somehow. So if you ask AI, that's the risk of AI. And the other problem is, I mean, Java has a release cycle of 6 months currently. Also, the frameworks have 6 months release cycles, at least Spring Framework. And this also is a problem because you usually get outdated information from AI. So if you would ask some AI, please write me some code with stream gatherers, then I don't know if they know already what stream gatherers are.
Probably not. I don't think so. Yeah, those are very good points. And I really don't know how the market will behave in that context, because like you said, all of those simple tasks can be easily done with AI. And if they say that developers will be no longer needed, like junior or intermediate developers will be no longer needed, how they will become senior? It's impossible. I think this equation doesn't work very well. Doesn't make much sense. I remember that Mark Zuckerberg said some time ago, oh, like in a few years, junior and intermediate developers will be extinguished. We're going to have only senior developers. But how they will become senior without being junior and intermediate, it's impossible. Doesn't make any sense. So yeah, I don't know what's going to happen exactly.
Yeah. And the point is, by the way, it's in every field. So this morning I was with my accountant and we were talking about AI. And he told the same thing because in accountant domain, you can also use AI for simple tasks. But if he gets a new accountant who is learning the business, he needs to do these simple tasks first, right? Because if he wants to do the difficult tasks, he needs to learn the simple tasks first. And he needs to know how accounting works and stuff like that. And if this is generated by AI, only he as a senior accountant can understand what AI is generating for him. But the person that just started with accounting has no clue what the result is from this bookkeeping AI, for example. And that's also, and he said the same, we need still to basic stuff, junior stuff to learn things. And if this is done by AI, we will not learn that. That's the other problem. So you will not get seniors if you don't do mistakes, right? And the junior maybe does a lot of mistakes because he doesn't know the framework, he doesn't know the language, he has no clue what he's doing. At least I had no clue when I wrote
Me
my
neither.
first COBOL program. My first program was in BASIC, but it doesn't matter. So it ran, but I had no clue why. So, right. And then I had to learn from the books because there was no internet, how it works and why it works. I had to ask people to explain me or to help me. And this is a process that you need to master some topic. You need to make errors, you need to learn the basics, you need to learn the concepts, and then you will become a senior. And if this step is missing, then you will not become a senior. And sometimes all seniors are retired, and
Yeah, so this equation doesn't work exactly. Okay, very good. So many of my mentees also want to become a Java champion. And I'd like to know more about your journey of becoming a Java champion.
the point is, I think for every Java champion, becoming the Java champion is not the goal, right? That's just happened
Yes.
somewhere in your career. And in my case, it happens because I was writing and especially speaking about what I'm doing publicly. Because you need to get noticed somehow by other peoples, especially by other Java champions, because you will need to get nominated by Java champions and then they will vote for you if you want to become a Java champion. And so my journey was more a coincidence, finally. I mean, sharing knowledge was always my thing that I like to do because I'm a lecturer at universities. I also, when we had the Java group at Swiss Railways, we had an internal developer conference. We were also doing meetups with the Java developers because Java back in 2000 was very new, especially Java EE. So we had to learn from each other. And we had like Java group. And they still have the developer conference for Swiss Railways, by the way. I was in the committee that was organizing the conference in the beginning, and they still invite me to have a talk there. So that's a great reunion to meet old friends every year at the conference. And so I really always like to do that. So also the point that I started the Java user group in Bern is beneficial because that shows the other Java champions that you're caring about the ecosystem, that you care about the community, that you like to spread the word about Java, or not about Java as a language per se, but also about the whole ecosystem around Java, and that you talk about, I do workshops publicly at conferences, or we have like workshop days in Switzerland where you can submit your workshop and then people can come. That happens every year. Like we have 3 days workshops. Great thing. And so to help each other to get started with Java or with frameworks and stuff like that. And that's the way you finally can become a Java champion.
Basically, by sharing your knowledge, contributing to the Java community, and doing it because you want, because it's something you enjoy to do, and becoming a Java champion will be a consequence, right?
Exactly.
Like by obviously being visible between other Java champions and making an impact to the Java community will help you to eventually be nominated as a Java champion. And since the Java champions can see the work you are doing, you're going to be accepted and you're going to become a Java champion.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there are different programs for example, the Oracle ACE program, where we are both member of it, where you can self-nominate yourself. So it's there, the program's totally different. You have also contribute to what you're doing, like the Java ecosystem, for example, in my case, and you get points for your contributions. And then you can contribute, and as long as you maintain a certain level of points, then you will stay on your Oracle ACE Pro, for example, level, and you will be rewarded with that title. But when you stop to do that, then you will no longer be an Oracle ACE because you will not have the points. So that's a completely different way of a program. Whereas if you're a Java champion, you usually stay a Java champion. If you're retired, for example, then you will still be a Java champion because it's like an award that you get. I'm also a Vaadin champion, by the way. They have a similar concept where they also give that away to people that are contributing to Vaadin in the community, spreading the word about that. So it's absolutely the same idea behind. There are other Docker captains and stuff like that. There are a lot of programs out there, not only Java champions. The Java champions program is a bit different because it was created by Java people back in the days. And the other programs are usually backed by a company. I mean, Java Champions is also backed by Oracle because the name Java is owned by Oracle. But the origin of the Java Champion program is not with Oracle. So it was done back in the days, but there was a group of people who introduced that program. And Vaadin Champion is for sure created by the Vaadin company behind the framework, or Docker Captains, for example, by the Docker company, or Oracle ACE for sure by the Oracle company.
Nice. Yeah, it's definitely a huge honor to be part of the Java Champions group.
Absolutely. When I was young developer, I knew about the Java Champions. Adam Bien, for example, is very popular in the German-speaking part because it's in Germany. And I always looked up to the Java Champions because I think, wow, these are really people that know everything. But that's not exactly true. They know a lot, but not everybody knows everything, right? Nobody can know everything. So you really can be a Java champion depending on different aspects of Java. So you can teach Java, for example, or you can be contributing to open source projects, for example, to popular or non-popular open source projects, to one or to many. There are really a lot of ways to give back something to the community. Right? And the title is Java Champion, but doesn't mean that I'm the best Java programmer in the world, right? I'm contributing to Java ecosystem. I'm not the expert Java developer who knows everything.
Yeah, no one knows everything. Not even James Cosman, the creator of Java. It's impossible. Like, the Java ecosystem is so huge that if you even try to learn everything, like, how many years? Maybe 1,000 years you would learn everything?
You will never finish because there are always new frameworks, new Java language features. You will never stop learning, right? So that's impossible to learn. Yeah, no, I just mentioned that because when I became a Java champion, a few weeks later, someone asked me on LinkedIn if I can help him with a Java problem. Really deep. I don't know if it was even JNI or something like that. And then I had to tell him, sorry, I can't help you, but I know someone who knows you because there are other people in the group or in the ecosystem that are really Java experts. They can get in touch with these people as well. So also the language architect like Brian Gutz, for example, or other people are also there to help. So everybody's very open, in my opinion, in the Java ecosystem and eager to help. And that's maybe something that I really like about the Java ecosystem, because that's probably in other ecosystems not that case. Or at least I don't know the other ecosystems well enough to judge them if they are open as Java ecosystem or not. But here we are really open. Like, you can go to conference, you can talk to the speakers. They are really there and like to talk to the people. So if you're afraid to ask during a talk, for example, just get in touch to the speakers after the talk.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I see Java developers the Java developer community is definitely the strongest between the other programming languages. And the other thing I like about Java Champions is that every one of us, we are so approachable. And this is something I really like about the Java community. Like, if there's a Java developer who needs help, you can just reach out to us and we're gonna help. We're gonna help you as soon as possible, obviously. Very good. So how is life in Switzerland? What do you enjoy the most and what do you like the least?
That's usually very hard because I'm born in Switzerland, so it's very hard to judge around country. But the difference with other countries I met so far is Switzerland is very small. And you notice that in many cases during your life. So for example, if you travel around in Switzerland, you are never alone. So you have to go high up in the mountains, maybe there you're alone, but usually if you drive from town to town, there is not a lot of land between the towns where there are no buildings, for example. So that's one point about Switzerland. Switzerland is also very expensive. That's good and a bad thing. So on the good side, it's that the salaries are also high, especially, or they are not as high as people think, maybe. So it really depends, because if you're hearing salary studies, you often hear also from United States, for example, if you hear about the salary from a Google developer who earns a lot of money, that's probably like an exception. That's not the usual case. But we have higher salaries because the rents are high, the prices are high. So that's probably the issue in Switzerland. If you come from another country to Switzerland as a tourist, for example, or for a conference, then everything seems to be very expensive. That's for sure on that side. What I really like about Switzerland is the politics that we have here, because we don't have a single president. That doesn't exist in Switzerland. So we have a group of people who are responsible for the country, so to say, and we have parliament that is doing the politics work, and we have a lot of different parties, and none of the party really has the majority. So they really have to find ways how to, if there are some things that they have to vote on, they really have to find a way to work together to get a decision at the end. And that's something that really special in Switzerland, in my opinion. We usually try to find a solution together somehow. So we are used to have this democratic system. This is very good because everybody can share his opinion and work on that. But the problem is this takes the process much longer. If everybody can have his opinion, then it takes long to find a final idea or a final decision. But that's everywhere like this. So also the states, they're called cantons in Switzerland, are very autonomous. So they are also like, if you want to have a decision for Switzerland, for the whole country, then you also need the majority of all cantons to make that work. So that's maybe another issue, that we have this democratic system in Switzerland. But that, in my opinion, that's very good because we can have our opinion. We have a lot of thing about a lot of things which other countries cannot vote about. So that's very, very important in my opinion. But it's also nice in Switzerland because it's so small. We know each other very well. That could be good or bad, depending on how you see it. But from the ecosystem perspective, as a Java developer, for example, or as a person in IT industry, I used to work in Bern. Usually that's the capital of Switzerland. It's not exactly the capital, but I won't explain it to you now because that's very complicated. But there, like the ecosystem of IT people is quite small. So you have government and finance and also insurance companies, but more or less the people know each other. And if you're moving from one company to another, you learn other people or learn to know other people. And some people do the tour around the companies, others stay with the same companies. They meet each other more or less. So it's very common that you know people from other companies and what they're doing and how the company works and stuff. So you learn a lot. about that. That's probably a benefit. And compared to other countries, maybe we also have, based on the climate, which is very moderate. So we have, but it's not too cold, but we have in the mountains at least still snow. But this is kind of an issue because of global warming. We also have less snow than we used to be. So a lot of ski resorts have problems now because they don't have enough snow in the winter, for example. And in the summer, it's usually not that hot. It's also get hotter. And that could be also a problem because we don't have air conditioning in the usual buildings. And if it's hot, then it's hot. So that's a problem. But it's still good. And we don't have any thunderstorms, or we have thunderstorms, but they are really normal. We don't have tornadoes or flooding or stuff like that. So that's probably a benefit of the climate that we have. And it's also due to the mountains that we have, that the weather is moderate in that terms.
I really like how society works in Switzerland because you don't have kind of two parties in two different groups in like the left wing and the right wing in the government, and they oppose to each other. So instead, you unite the forces and you reach to a decision together. I really
Yes.
like this because I really like that because in the US or in Brazil, it's different. People have different ideas, and the left usually fight the right wing ideas. And I think this means that you are, like in Switzerland, you have a more advanced society.
Yeah, I also think we can talk about politics without having a fight. So because the whole system is based on opinion or exchange your opinion with others and to learn from the other opinions. And for sure, we also have right wings and left wing parties and also people that do not like to talk with other people. But usually, most of the time, they will find some way how to work together. And that's something that's really unique and makes it better. I mean, especially what I like most, that we don't have a president and that has too much power. So that really helps that we have kind of a moderate way to do things and to find decisions and to work together. And we have to work together to find a solution. And we don't have some single person who can tell, okay, let's do it that way.
Amazing. I really like that. And Simon, what books or courses do you recommend for Java developers?
There are a lot of great books because I'm very lucky. As a lecturer, I have access to the O'Reilly books, or more or
Nice.
less all books. So there are also other publishers included in that library. What I like is books about, so there are different types of books. I really like what I did when I started with Java. We had a learning group and we were doing the Java certification together. Because I don't like certifications that much, because just learning to get the certification, that's not good, or that's not what I like to do. But what I liked back in the days, or I then later also did the Java E Architect certification, is that we had a group to learn together. So in my opinion, if you have some friends, for example, you can choose any book and read it together. So doing a book club, something like that, reading a book together, discuss about the book. If you're doing a certification, for example, that's very helpful. You can take the certification books, for example, and then learn together, chapter by chapter, doing exercises together, doing maybe a simple application together from a book. That really helps, because just reading a book without doing some hands-on work is kind of boring. But I also like books like with some puzzles inside, for example, or quizzes. That's very interesting. So from a low-level programming perspective. But I also like books from, for example, Neil Ford, which are more about architecture, for example, because these books are here to stay. If you're doing a book about Spring Boot, for example, then it's probably outdated after a year or two. But if you're writing a book about concepts, this book or the ideas may stay. They may change from the ideas, but probably some of the concepts are still relevant. And also the books from Martin Fowler, for example, are still relevant in my opinion. And they are really helpful. But I also, sometimes it's also good to read about other stuff, maybe more or less more about team building, for example, or domain-driven design, for example. Domain-driven design is, by the way, a very interesting book, but no one reads it. That's probably because it's very thick, but it's not about, I mean, domain-driven design is a special book because it has two parts, and one part is about domain-driven design and talking to people, talking to customers, talking to business people to get the requirements. That's very good. And then you have kind of the idea how to implement that, but that's less good, in my opinion. Or less good, that's less important. But people who are into DDD use always the implementation thing first, because they think they have to find a complicated architecture to implement domain-driven design, but that's... And so I really can't recommend a single book because there are many I like, but because here that's the books that I still have on paper, and there are some that are interesting. For example, if you're in, where do we have it? Oh, it's here. That's my favorite book, by the way, that I still have. I don't know if you know that. It's called Lean Software Development. It's by Murray and Tom Poppendieck. These two are now already retired for a long time, but in the year 2000 and a bit later, I think the book is also from 2000 somewhat, something. And they were taking concepts from lean manufacturing. So the main concept, or there are a few like concepts, and one is eliminate waste. So that's the most important thing. Don't do things that are not necessary. And now with Agile, we have some problems, in my opinion, because Agile is usually dysfunctional. It's more like a mini waterfall or a micromanagement from the Scrum Master or the product owner. And the teams are not really Agile, in my opinion. And I really like to bring this book to my customers and tell them, hey, look at this book. So that's real Agile. So really do only things that you need. That's not only true for the process, it's only true for your codes. Just write the code you need, and all code you don't write has no bugs and doesn't need to be maintained. It's very simple in that case. But I also like to read the manuals, by the way, or as I told you, the Jakarta E specifications, for example, because there's a lot of interesting information in it. And if you want to learn, for example, let's say the Spring Boot framework, maybe just go to the official documentation. Don't go to Stack Overflow or any other website. Maybe just start with the official documentation. And when you think there is missing something or you need more information, then you can go and look for other sources. But maybe already the regular manual or the tutorials that they create are already helpful enough. But I mean, recommending a book is a bit hard because beside the books, there are also like great blogs. Like you write a lot of articles, they are very helpful, should be read by developers. So you find a lot of information which is not written on books, but in blogs, for example. But you always has to, and that's a bit the difficult thing, you have to figure out if the information is still relevant or not. Because we're moving so fast and the information can be outdated. So if I would read a book, I would really take a book that's about architecture. You can use an old one or read an old one. If you read about Java programming language, then it's very hard to keep the pace, right? So if you buy a book today, until this is released and published, a new Java version is already here, and you will miss the newest feature in that book. So but the book can still be a good starting point, and then you can add the information that you have with the new versions, simpler, for example.
So basically, focus on architecture books, maybe Spring books, but like you said, Spring books will get outdated very quickly. But really mainly reads documentation. Documentation will be up to date, and it's going to help you to become a better Java developer. And you also mentioned specifically the book Lean Software Development, so that you develop what is really necessary and you have an effective process to deliver software as well. Very good. So my last question to you, Simon, is what key career insight would you like to share with intermediate and senior Java developers specifically?
In my opinion, the most important part or the most important point is you should stay curious. So you should, if you're working, how should I say? I'm working on a customer project, or let's say I worked for Swiss Railways. And I worked on a project. In the beginning, it was very interesting. And during the years, so usually I was working for 2 or 3 years in the same project, it becomes boring. You know everything, it works, you have to maintain it, you have to fix bugs. Sometimes you're missing a challenge, right? And this was usually the time when I started a pet project. So what I also would recommend, I have a pet project because I'm in a sports club. So I used to do track and field in the sports club like many years ago. And we have track and field competitions for kids. And in 1997, I was writing software to do that, calculation and ranking lists. Because before they did that manually, and this was quite a lot of work to do that. They needed some 7 or 8 people to do that for over 100 kids. And now a single person could do that. So that's a good use case for do that. For a pet project, maybe you have something as well in your family, or you're in a club or in a community and you can write software for them, do that. Because if you have such a project, you exactly know the business case and all the requirements because you write it by your own, and you can try out the newest technology. So I started with Excel. By the way, the first version of this software was Excel, then Access. Then sooner or later I moved to Java, and now it's for sure a Vaadin project with Jooq. And I usually try new features. For example, currently I'm thinking about adding AI, maybe to how I could integrate something that maybe would be helpful. For example, instead of looking at the ranking list, you could ask which one was the person with the longest jump, for example, in long jump, and you get the result, something like that. And so if you have such a pet project, which is small, you can host it on GitHub. It's open source, mine. You can look at it, you can learn from it, and you can create pull requests if you don't like it, or you can fill issues if you want to use it, or if you find it could be improved. And this helps, because you cannot learn at the company. And that's usually a fault or problem. I don't know if you know the term CV-driven development.
I heard
or conference-driven development. So you start a project and you heard about AI, LangChain, 4J, and you want to integrate that in your project. You also heard about Kafka and Kubernetes. You need all that stuff, put it into your application, and finally you don't need that, probably because you don't have the requirements for that, and it may become over-engineered, and maybe it has kind of an additional problem because it may introduce bugs because you're on the bleeding edge. So you use technology that is not production ready, maybe. Or you have to learn a lot of things, and finally you like get overwhelmed by all the technology that you use, and you don't see the real business requirements, and you don't add value for the customer. No, for sure, again, we are on a management problem because the manager should not allow to do that, right? Because you should use the technology that best fits the requirement. But a lot of time developers try new things in a real world project. And I don't do that because I want to deliver a solution for my customers with a proven technology that I'm 100% sure that this will work. And that I also find documentation, I find other developers who know that technology, that we have a sustainable application. But in my pet projects, and I have many more of them, because you can imagine a sports club has a lot of requirements for software, I can do whatever I want. I can change the framework, I can change the database model, I can use NoSQL, I can use whatever I like to do because it's on my own. And I do not have to, if it doesn't work, it's my problem, right? It's not the problem of my customer. No one is losing money, but I get a bad
Reputation.
Exactly. Thank you. Because people think he's not a good software developer, right? And that's really something you should do. And the other thing that I already said, find an industry you like. So don't go to a bank because you think you earn more money as a software developer, instead going to a retail company as a software developer, because sometimes it gets boring. Because if you're not into, I don't know, finance stuff, and you really don't like to calculate stuff, whatever, then don't do that. Really find an industry that you like. It makes life easier. And as I said, usually technology will become boring at some point because you really can't be on the bleeding edge. And then it's better if the industry is interesting and you can solve real business problems because you also get to some point where you really understand the business and the business cases, and you can suggest improvements from your side. You see something that maybe the user is doing and you think, hey, you could do that maybe in another way, and not technology wise, but in terms of the software. And that's my advice, because good software also comes from people who like to work with the software. That's why I mentioned my pet project, because it's a pet project, and as a pet, I take care of that. So it'll never be in a bad shape, for example. I really care about it. And if you have a product mindset in your company with your project, you're doing the same. So you will not introduce technical debt into your pet project, right? Because you care for it. And if you really care for something, people also stay longer in the projects, because one problem with technical debt when we are already there is that a lot of time people are changed in the project during the life cycle of an application. And very often these are external consultants, as I am. And I don't know how you feel when you go to an existing application, but my feeling, or the feeling of most developers, is most often, what's that? Who did that? Why is this so bad? We should do that in another way. Let's re-engineer it. Let's refactor it. That's bad code. They use the framework I don't like. We must change it. But that's absolutely the wrong mindset, right? Because there's the reason why it's like that. So you should find out the reason why it's that, and then you can improve it. If then you still feel that it needs improvement, maybe because of some requirements, it's exactly that way, and it doesn't need any improvement. So when you don't understand the code, it doesn't mean that the code is bad. It simply means that you didn't understand the code, or probably didn't understand the requirements and the business.
Wow, very nice. So basically, have your own personal projects, stay curious, find problems you like, find the business you like. And also, when you see codes that you don't like, don't judge the developers. Just be calm, analyze the context of the situation. It could be many things. It could be that the specific problem they were solving, like they had to use this technology, or maybe they had to write code very fast because the company needed to deliver the software fast. So when you see code that you don't like, be calm. Don't just judge people saying, oh, they're bad developers. I think that's very good mindset to have as well.
Yeah.
And
because I had to learn that for myself, because when I get better during my career, when I get the senior developer, I suddenly thought, and I was very young back then, like maybe 27, 28, something like that. I thought, now I know everything, right? I know how to use, for example, Spring. I'm the Spring expert here. And then I came to another project and I said, they're doing it wrong. And I tend to change everything and say, no, you're doing it wrong. But first of all, that's a very bad mindset, because you don't make friends with that mindset, right? Because you're offending other people, because maybe it's their pet project and they like the code how it is and they know why it is. and you know nothing, right? And so that I had to learn first, because I had also conflicts in the beginning when I had that mindset, and I had to remove that mindset from myself. And this really helps, because you don't judge the code. So, I mean, it's there for a reason. As you said, maybe they had to go fast, maybe they didn't knew better, whatever, but it's there and it works. That's the point, right? Why should you change code that works? That's another mindset. So people tend to remove things or change things just because it doesn't look like that. And then you have a problem, because if in a project people change a lot, then you have a lot of different styles in the code. And you can see from the style which developer did that part of the application, or at what time during the life cycle of the application this code was created. And that's not good. So you really should try to be consistent with the project.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that makes life so much easier, because if you're joining a new company and you want to create a conflict with everyone, then you are in a very bad place, because people won't like you. You're going to have, you're going to make your life really a lot more difficult, because it's going to be even harder to influence people as well. Because if you're telling bad things about their code, they won't be your friends. Definitely not, because code is kind of our pride, right? We are proud when we write our code. Doesn't matter if it's good or bad. It's our code, right? So if a developer goes to another developer and say, hey, I don't like your code is horrible, you're going to create an enemy. And
Absolutely.
having enemies when you join a company, I think that's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good, Simon. Thank you so much for all your insights and for sharing all your experience with the Java Challengers audience. I learned a lot from you, and I'm really grateful you accepted the invitation to be here. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It was a pleasure to talk with you. I could talk for hours. You may notice it, but yeah, it was a very good time. And thank you very much.
I wish that we meet soon in a conference or in a Java user group, and it was amazing to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.